Hi everyone, I'm Reverend Jim Keat, the digital minister at the Riverside Church, and this is The Word Made Fresh, a weekly video Bible study and sermon prep resource, and this week we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. It's the Hebrew scripture reading for this Sunday's lectionary text. Unless you're watching this like way in the future, then it was the lectionary text for January 17th, 2021, and then again in like 3 years and 6 years, because that's how the lectionary works. Anyway, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are about, you guessed it, Samuel. They pick up where the book of Judges left off, because we still don't have a king on the scene. That will come in a few chapters. And the people are led by a judge, like Deborah and Samson and all the judges from the book of Judges. And the current judge, also functioning as the high priest at Hebron, is it Shiloh? I think it's Hebron, is Eli. And whether they know it or not, the time of the judges is coming to a close. Because when a king steps on the scene, the judges disappear. Well, it's not that they disappear, but it's that they're replaced by the kings. But then we have a new role introduced, the prophets. Now, the first two chapters of 1 Samuel introduce us to his mother, Hannah, and how she dedicated Samuel to God even before he's born. It's a great story. You should read it, Samuel chapter 1. And so she ends up leaving him to be raised at the temple by Eli. When I say temple, I mean tabernacle, because the temple's not actually built yet until Solomon and all that stuff. In chapter 2, we meet Eli's sons, the epitome of misusing their privilege for their own personal gain rather than the benefit of the people. Does anyone come to mind who is kind of a leader at the time with sons who misuse their positions of power and privilege? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, that's where chapter 3 picks up. The chapter opens with two sentences to set up the scene. Here's what they say. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. Now it's nighttime. Here we see Samuel, probably 11 years old or so. At least that's what the first century Jewish historian Josephus thought. He's falling asleep in the tabernacle. His mentor Eli is getting old. The text tells us that Eli's eyesight had begun to grow dim, so he could not see. And Samuel is lying there, just about to fall asleep, when he hears a voice call his name. You might have heard this story before. Now, thinking it's Eli calling for him, he jumps up and runs to Eli and says, "Here I am, for you called me." Eli's confused because he did not call Samuel, so he sends Samuel back to bed. Only the same thing happens a second and then a third time. And the text adds an interesting note here. In verse 7, saying that Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. Spoiler alert, that's about to change. After the third time, Eli thinks that this could be God speaking to Samuel. He tells him that when he hears the voice calling his name again, to respond by saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And that is exactly what happens. Like I said, you're probably familiar with this story. It's kind of one of the classics. But let's talk about two specific things about this. First, just briefly, way to go, Eli. I mean, he's being woken up again and again in the middle of his sleep by this preteen priest in training, and he offers this advice to Samuel. Because sometimes God might be speaking, only you don't recognize it, and you need someone else to help you tune your ears. And second, this moment is huge, especially after the word of the Lord was rare in those days and visions were not widespread thing mentioned in verse 1. Basically, this all sets Samuel up to take the mantle from Eli and introduces the shift from judge to prophet. Verse 19, a little bit later in this section, says, "As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord." Now, I think this transition from Eli to Samuel, from judge and high priest to prophet, it's fascinating. The former, the high priest, works to maintain a system, whereas the latter works to start a new movement. And this is really where I think that a text like this resonates in our world today. Because there's a lot of religious people who want to keep a system going because it works really well for them. But we need prophets to critique the stale systems, to hear what God is saying and see what God is doing, and then invite us all to participate in that movement. I think of all the religious images and language invoked at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, from a cross raised on the lawn to flags with Trump and Jesus printed on them interchangeably, an ideology fueled by religion that wants to go back to some mythical greatness in our past. But the only way is forward, as we see in 1 Samuel. You can't go back to the high priests and the judges. You have to go forward to the prophets. And we need to listen to what God is saying now and respond as it invites us into our future. Now, in this text, we see Eli's sons misusing their positions as priests for their own personal gain, and God is still speaking out against people who continue to do the same in our world today, because it's always been about a movement for love and justice and liberation, not a machine to be maintained for personal gain, nor a monument to be remembered in some idealized past. The power of a story like this in 1 Samuel isn't whether or not it happened, because that's a whole other conversation, but the fact that it keeps happening. God is still speaking. But are we listening? Do we even know what we're listening for? I think a text like this invites us to be both Eli and Samuel. We can be Eli when we help others tune their ears to hear the voice of God and give them the courage to respond. And we can be Samuel when we hear God speaking to us, and rather than talking over this voice or assuming we know exactly what it means, we respond as Samuel did. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So there you go, 1 Samuel chapter 3. Why don't you go ahead and leave a comment below with your thoughts on this text? What does it mean for us to listen to God's voice in our world today? And when we do, what might she be saying? And if you're leading a Bible study or preaching a sermon from this text, where's it taking you? Leave a comment down there so we can all chat with one another and learn from each other. And then be sure to come back next week, because we'll have another episode of The Word Made Fresh. I'll see you there.